This is History Myths and Myth Conceptions, and today's myth conception is homosexuality in ancient Rome and Greece. We've come a long way in our perception of homosexuality in the ancient world, and in general. Christianity emphasized that Greco-Roman civilization was a civilization of godless perverts. They had orgies, everyone slept with everyone, and they all burn in hell. A few decades ago, the ideology has changed, and now we're discussing another serious problem. Ancient Greeks and ancient Romans suddenly were
not gay enough.
So any inquiry into how people actually lived is always contaminated with ideology, and usually the bottom line is, whatever they were doing it wrong. It is just an established tradition, and this tradition must go. Let's try to look at what was happening without any emotions and without looking down upon people of Rome and Greece. Like we got everything figured out and they were idiots. They were not.
Okay, Paul, in this round, I'm going to ask you to picture two men having sex.
Done.
Let me finish.
First of all, when we're talking about Greeks and Romans, we're talking about centuries and centuries, and we're talking about slightly different societies. So obviously, social conventions, culture, and ideas were in a flux. What was true for Athens in the age of Pericles can be not entirely true for Rome of Marcus Aurelius. And we're dealing with a complex subject that can't be sufficiently covered in a few minutes' time. So there will be certain generalizations and examples from different periods. The whole concept of human sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome was quite different from what we have right now, which, as always, makes mechanical transplantation of modern concepts to the ancient world very problematic. People are looking for gay people or transgender people or non-binary people in ancient world, and they find just people. People who lived in societies that were different enough to invalidate the majority of these time-traveling concepts. When we're dealing with ancient Greece and ancient Rome, we're not only dealing with societies where same-sex relationships were more or less tolerated and seen as something quite normal and trivial. We're also dealing with the societies that didn't have a clear dividing line between heterosexuality and homosexuality. It was mostly just sexuality. There was some distinction because Greeks and Romans were not idiots, but at times it looks like they thought that the majority of people were essentially inherently bisexual. They didn't have any weird discussions that a certain percentage, like 7% or something, of human population is exclusively attracted to the same sex. They had centuries of practical experience, and the percentage of people, at least males, who at some point had same-sex relationship apparently was huge. If you read, say, Plato's Symposium, which takes place in Athens in the 5th century BC, you can easily figure out that all of the characters in this dialogue had same-sex relationships at some point of their lives. Yeah, all of them. Most of them were also married to a woman and had children. In many ways, all of this was seen as some sort of a lifestyle, not a biologically predetermined behavior, because, if anything, they just considered everyone biologically bisexual. Now, the same-sex relationships usually, although not always, gravitated around the concept of pederasty, when one of the partners was older and sometimes much older than the other one. Obviously, there were exceptions, but generally these exceptions were something that the majority of the population couldn't quite understand. Like, what's the point? If you had shown them a modern couple of 40-year-old men, they'd probably think that these people are perverts or something. If one of them is 40 and the other one is 16, then yeah, makes sense. Some of the ancient Greek states essentially institutionalized pederasty. The main example is Sparta, where assigning a mentor to a teenage boy was a part of the educational system. It was seen as a mutually beneficial relationship. The teacher is really interested in the progress of his student and genuinely attached to him. While the student is really close to his teacher, he is very grateful and shows a lot of respect to his mentor. And healthy pederasty, not predatory pederasty, was sometimes seen in this light outside of Sparta as well. I carefully picked the words for this explanation. Otherwise, some of the people in the audience might throw up and won't be able to watch films about the 300 Spartans anymore.
Madman! You're a madman!
It must be also noted that some scholars think that the tradition for the Spartan girls to shave their heads for their wedding originated in the idea that it should be easier for the husband to make a transition from homosexual relationships to heterosexual relationship. You know, shave a girl's head, now she looks kinda like a boy. Obviously, it didn't really work that way outside of Sparta during a certain period of time, but since we're talking about Hellenic or heavily Hellenized cultures, the attitude usually was somewhat similar. And the accent was mostly on pederasty. The focus was on homosexual relationships between men. We don't really have much information on relationships between women, even despite the fact that the term lesbian is derived from the name of the island of Lesbos and reinforced by the remaining fragments of Sappho's poetry. And one of the main points was always the question of yeah, if you take the passive role, you're seen as some sort of a younger, subordinate party. This question of who's penetrating who is reflected in the Greek myths, and inappropriate course of actions is generally considered not a good idea. For example, if a Greek god desires a mortal woman, it is kind of fine. If a Greek goddess desires a mortal man, that's a problem. Because, you know, a goddess doesn't have a penis, which automatically means that she will be penetrated by a mortal. Her status is significantly higher, but she becomes a subordinate of a lesser being. And that's degrading. That's problematic. Check the myth about Aphrodite and Anchises. The behavior of Aphrodite, her shame, and the fear of Anchises, who understands that he's in trouble. It ended relatively well for him in the most popular version of the myth, only an injury. Although there is a version where he was actually killed. But then there is a myth about Ios and Tithonus, one of the scariest stories in all of Greek mythology. Basically, everything was seen through the prism of
Who's on top?
No, thank you. I'm not playing this. Good luck. Nice meeting you.
there was always a question of social status or age. If your social status is lower, or if you're younger, you're on the receiving end. And that's kind of normal. That's how it is supposed to be. If the roles were reversed, well, very unconventional, very indecent. Things like that were frowned upon. What now? A grown-up man of a higher rank suddenly likes to be a girl in the bedroom? What's wrong with you? So if you're reading one of the famous historical chronicles by a Roman author and you find wild stories of how a certain bad emperor was engaging in sexual intercourse with men and how licentious he was, well, it is pretty much always not about homosexuality per se. It is about being on the receiving end when you're the emperor of Rome. This is just scandalous behavior, and that's why it is always used as one of the tools for character assassinations. And also one of the reasons why today some people say that Greeks and Romans were
Not gay enough.
traditional type of Hellenic same-sex relationships was tolerated, well, in the case of Sparta, even encouraged, and you never really had much choice. But actual, real relationships, long-term relationships, were very rare, and the concept of same-sex marriage just didn't make any sense. Once again, homosexuality was seen, in a way, as some sort of a lifestyle of a bisexual man. The stories about emperors like Nero and Elagabalus trying to actually marry a human with a penis were used once again for the sake of slandering these historical figures, and are not really grounded in reality. The famous story of Nero and his husband/wife is just a wild anecdote. He couldn't legally marry this guy. He had trouble marrying even one of his wives, a woman, just because of the difference in social status. You cannot have a religious ceremony if you are from the stock of people of consular rank and your bride is a freed woman or a child of a freedman. Nero had to invent a backstory linking his bride with some legendary people of importance. And now we're talking about a marriage where both parties not only have a rift in their social status, but they also have penises and can't have children. It was legally impossible, just like appointing your horse a consul. As you might guess, since same-sex relationships were quite ubiquitous and were part of the tradition, neither Greeks nor Romans had any serious urges to promote tolerance or inclusivity through constant attempts of raising awareness and empowering someone. Homosexual activities were never seen as a virtue, although some of the characters in the above-mentioned Plato's Symposium actually advance the idea that same-sex relationships are superior to relationships with women, because women are stupid. But that's not the opinion of Plato. He's just mocking people and setting the stage for his alter ego, Socrates. Anyway, this is quite different from modern situation in a number of countries where sometimes promotion of long-needed tolerance and the general concept of, first of all, minding your own business goes a bit too far, and suddenly things you do in your bedroom or elsewhere gets presented as some kind of a moral virtue. Come on, American Gods TV series had an episode where a homosexual orgy was presented as something beautiful, romantic, and worth of admiration. The ancients obviously had a different opinion. First of all, they were not fans of orgies. And also some authors were mentioning desire for boys in the same sentence with things like drinking habit. Obviously, Greco-Roman civilization produced lots of ideas about pretty much everything, so even before the rise of Christianity, there were people who absolutely denounced same-sex relationships. Well, apart from certain philosophers who denounced all the sexual activities, like Epicurus. The most famous and important example is the ancient Stoics. Their negative approach to the subject came from the fact that at a certain point, from the period of Middle Stoa and later on, they came to a conclusion that basically since promiscuity is a bad and unnatural thing, then homosexual activities are bad and unnatural as well. Because in the framework of Greco-Roman civilization, in this particular society, it was seen as exactly that, a promiscuous behavior and a lifestyle. These are not real relationships. They don't lead to creation of a family. You can't conceive a child, even theoretically. It is just biologically impossible. It was a bit revolutionary approach that walked hand in hand with limiting sex exclusively to relationships with personal commitment and stipulation that women are equal to men. Well, more or less. And therefore, they are equal in this partnership. Which means, for example, that Stoics were actually telling Greeks that you can't sleep with household slaves or visit prostitutes, because your wife is forbidden to do the same. So the same rules must be applied to you. It was a groundbreaking idea at the time, a sexual revolution, so to speak. Greeks were a little bit puzzled by this line of thinking, but Romans, at least higher classes, were positively impressed, which tells you a couple of things about Roman society. Even these family-oriented philosophers, or some of the asexual philosophers, were quite tolerant, and the idea that someone should be persecuted because of stuff they do in the bedroom was mostly non-existent. This is simply a truly exotic concept and a wild aberration that emerged much later. Today, it is quite fascinating to watch how people look down upon this situation in Greco-Roman culture, like these weird guys were dead wrong about things, and now we finally sorted everything out. While in some modern countries of the world, homosexual activities are punished by death. In others, these activities almost encouraged, despite the fact that countries like Britain treated homosexuality with chemical castration only a few decades earlier. Greek and Roman ideas on the subject might seem strange, but they come from centuries of relative tolerance, centuries of observation, and general understanding how things work in the context of Hellenistic cultures.